move
Thank
forward.
you very much. Thank you very much. And it is certainly my pleasure and honor to be a part of this particular discussion. I must thank the organizers for inviting me to give a talk. This is certainly a very timely event when we are actually discussing cross-border transnational. And obviously, we are talking about multidimensional cooperation modalities among different countries when every country is struggling with new dimensions posed by pandemics and obviously new geopolitics that my friend Professor Ride has talked about. And I was quite fascinated to listen to my friend from Romania when he talked about the possible linkages between the Balkans and the Southeast Asia. And that's particularly one new dimension that we need to remember, that the interdependence among the countries are rising at an astronomical speed because the political capital as well as the economic capitals linking the development aspiration among the states are fundamentally changing, given the new dimensions that we have seen during and certainly if we consider the current moment as the post-pandemic world. Now, my assumption when I looked into this particular dialogue or perhaps the discourse that we are aiming towards is to really find out where the countries which are emerging as a power fulcrum in geopolitics and geoeconomics, because my fundamental thesis often relies on a basic principle that the whole old-fashioned idea of geopolitics or old-fashioned interest that the states used to pursue in the name of geostrategy is perhaps eroding with the emergence of the blurring space between geopolitics and geostrategy, in which the market, public health, and the technological innovations are coinciding with each other. Even we might be talking about the new technologies in terms of defense, but we also need to rethink about how do we use these technologies for the public health, which many of our countries eventually discarded during their development paradigms or perhaps the global development narratives or even interconnectivity. So we have largely been focusing on the international trade of goods, but we have often forgot to really put the issues such as public health as international good or common good to a large extent. And that is a harsh reminder. I mean, perhaps the COVID is a harsh reminder. And that's exactly where, when the South Asia was hit by COVID, we literally got into a massive, massive fiscal, human health, and perhaps political fiascos. And that was the moment when the countries came together and started to talk about the regional cooperation. And when we talk about regional cooperation, we also talked about it is not only the financial tools that will help us in mitigating the future of pandemics or natural disaster or financial shock, but perhaps the preparedness of the societal stability. Because pandemics, one of the four feature was the societal stability. Because now, if you look at the political structure of all these countries, starting from Germany or even French or even what is happening in the Dutch land, is perhaps also a reminder that the COVID is not only an issue of market or perhaps the fiscal issues, but it is also about the social stability and social reform. Now, even if you look all this political protest that is coming is linked with the entire economic as well as the political structure. That means we also have to heavily invest in the social norms and social governance, which is unseen or has never been talked about when it comes to the regional cooperation or economic cooperation. So that means obviously we have to look beyond the traditional approach of the regional interactions and connectivity. And perhaps this is what Hriday was talking about, how the regional cooperation or even the supply chain that he mentioned is not only to be seen through the prism of the goods, but also through the prism of how we create social capital among each other. Now, going back to one of the fundamental factors for the developing countries, or perhaps soon to be the middle income country like Bangladesh, we'll also be looking forward to have greater cooperation with the newly emerged market, or perhaps the emerging market, or perhaps the well-governed market that the Balkans as well as the Europeans would offer. Yes, the Chinese have a greater free trade free trade agreements or the talks going on or coming up with the European Union. The climate cooperation has a new dimension right now. And obviously, if you look at the new trade agreement that has been signed among the leading Southeast Asian market and the Chinese, as well as the Australians and the New Zealanders, which is called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's perhaps is a new game changer. I mean, almost like 30% of global GDP will be invested over here. And that will also create some sort of new momentum where the countries like Bangladesh, the countries like India has to rethink their approach, the global approach, as well as to drag the countries like those in the Balkans or those in the Eastern Europe or the Western Europe to come in. Because certainly when you're talking about 30% of global GDP having one sort of consensus in their economic outlook, where the geostrategic outlook will always be subsided beyond the media or perhaps geostrategic analysts' passionate interest by saying that, okay, we really need to look into the national security jargons. So I think, again, looking into those sort of structural issues, Bangladesh thoroughly has revised its foreign policy and engagement modalities over the past few years. And we are also looking forward to reaching out to the global community in terms of advancing not only the public health regimes, but also we are looking forward to engage ourselves in terms of social building, or the social capital building. Now, when we talk about the social capital building, we also look forward to really get into the greater collaboration in terms of education, in terms of social entitlements, and even to learn greater political stability dynamics, including the building of democratic institutions. That's where the challenge lies too, because we have a huge demography in the country, which certainly needs a huge impetus and perhaps governance tools, which often becomes very difficult to deliver given the resource crunch. That's where the whole idea of the migration comes in for us, the remittance comes in for us, and investment comes in for us. Remittance is another critical factor I must mention over here. This is equally applicable for India, Pakistan, even if you go to Far East, particularly Philippines and other countries. No, because we need the migration to take place under the WTO2 Mode 4, which is temporary movement for natural persons, as well as the migration regimes to factor in for the global supply chain to move in and the innovation and technology to go on. So which certainly calls for the greater mobility to be facilitated. And certainly we get to see that the rise of protectionism in terms of migration, the rise in more orthodox policies coming up in terms of mobility, which certainly we see as a concern, not only for Bangladesh or the South Asian countries, but overall collective development across the world. So these sort of challenges are one of the critical factors that I think requires greater intellectual interactions. And definitely that would require greater political understanding that should be supplemented by informed and forward-looking civil society inputs. With those sort of notes, I would conclude by saying that this is certainly a platform that should regularly meet and continue to discuss all these issues, regardless the borders. And perhaps we all have the cultural divisions, diversification, and that's the point where the divergence and convergence should come and allow us to come up with more concrete recommendations for further engagement among the regions and the countries, which often we used to consider as distant land. And we should also be looking forward to invest and perhaps review and therefore exchange the technological advancement that we have achieved over the period of time, whether it is at the indigenous level or the regional level, and perhaps at the sophisticated social level. Every innovation will matter in protecting the public health as well as the public intellectual resources. With that note, thank you very much for your patient hearing, and I look forward to further discussion in future. Thank you very much.